In 1931, the German parliament known as the Bundestag was firmly in control of the Nazi Party. This is a time period in which its eventual leader, Adolf Hitler, was elected to state government councillor and became a key figure in the German Interior Ministry, paving the way for his eventual rise to supreme leader of the German state. At the same time, Hitler and the Nazis were making their way through Europe, toppling cities like dominoes. Two separate groups on two different continents began forming and establishing a foothold in the international narcotics market, and would fortify what would later be known as the French Connection. One of the groups, commonly referred to as the American Mafia, was based out of New York City and was headed by Charles Lucky Luciano. The other sinister group, based out of Marseille, were comprised of Franco-Italian gangsters of Corsican descent, who together formed what would be called the Corsican Mafia, or as it was referred to in French, the Union Corsairs. It's said that despite the American Mafia's structure and reach, its godfather and leader, Lucky Luciano, was said to have an equal amount of respect and fear for the Corsican gangsters. So who were these men that Luciano feared? And how did they run one of the biggest dope smuggling operations the world has ever seen? Let's find out. I'm your host, Tony Hernandez, and this is Corruption Connection.
But we found there's a strong connection.
I would rather deal with organized crime than disorganized crime. Because in disorganized crime, everybody's out there doing whatever they wanted to do. In organized crime, only certain people can do it.
Dubbed the kings of the Marseille Underworld, Paul Carbone and Francois Spirito made up the core of the Corsican Mafia. Carbone, born in Corsica, while Spirito was born in Marseille, were two men who got their start as fixers for political godfather Simone Saviani. With Saviani's political protection, Carbone and Spirito established themselves as kings of vice in France's underworld, wielding control over gambling and prostitution, eventually leading them to a much more lucrative racket: heroin. In the beginning of the 1930s, Carbone and Spirito began the refining of opium in former French colonies of North Africa and Southeast Asia, eventually smuggling tons of raw opium to clandestine labs in Marseille for processing into some of the purest heroin the world has ever seen. The largest market for French heroin was, of course, the United States. While as far back as the early 1900s, Chinese merchants were smuggling raw opium to Jewish gangsters in New York City. One of those New York gangsters, Arnold Rothstein, also known as the Brain, was one of the largest drug traffickers of his time. Rothstein was a mentor to Charles Lucky Luciano, godfather of the American Mafia. Following in his mentor's footsteps, Luciano would establish his own connections to the international drug underworld. According to agents from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Luciano was a dope peddler since 1916, when he was first arrested for a small quantity of heroin. Upon Rothstein's death in 1927, Luciano would inherit his drug empire and continue with business as usual.
How are arrangements made for smuggling French heroin into the United States?
The Mafia gangsters of organized crime control the heroin racket in the United States. They make arrangements for the procurement of this heroin through the Sicilian mafiosi in Italy. They, in turn, contact, negotiate, and obtain heroin from the Corsicans in Marseille and Paris, France.
It was around this time where Luciano, alongside his crime partner, Meyer Lansky, would develop a relationship with the Corsican Mafia on their shared goal of supplying heroin to the Americas. It was said Luciano was somewhat intimidated by the sophistication of the Corsican operation. Nonetheless, the links were created between the two crime groups. In 1936, however, Luciano was thrown in jail where he received a 35-year sentence for compulsory prostitution. Luciano's arrest did not interfere with the smuggling operation, though, as he was able to keep a firm grasp on his crime family from behind bars. In regards to his prison sentence, Luciano and the American Mafia would receive a lifeline just a few years later. In July of 1943, as World War II raged on, the Allied forces landed on Sicily in order to stop Mussolini and the spread of the Nazi regime. However, they would be in foreign territory and needed help. In a landmark deal with the United States government, under the direction of Lucky Luciano, Sicilian Cosa Nostra members would guide American troops to ensure a safe landing on the island in exchange for Luciano's release from prison. The government agreed, and in 1946, Luciano was freed from prison and deported to Sicily. Coincidentally, around the same time, his crime partner Meyer Lansky was conducting a European tour in order to maintain and straighten contacts with the Corsican gangsters spread throughout the continent. His efforts paid off, and he was able to form bonds with the new rising power in the Corsican Mafia, the Guerini brothers. Brothers Antoine and Bartolome Guerini were leading crime bosses who used a French merchant shipping company to smuggle opium from Indochina to Marseille for the conversion to heroin. The effects of this newly founded relationship between the French gangsters and the American Mafia began to rear its head, especially in places like New York City. In the 1950s, as a result of the established alliance between the American and the French gangsters, pure white French heroin became readily available on American streets and was controlled by the Mafia, giving birth to what we know as the modern-day French Connection.
Does the Mafia then control the distribution of French heroin?
It very definitely does.
There seems to be agreement among experts that New York is the major marketplace for heroin in the United States. Where is the most of the heroin sold in New York manufactured?
Well, we believe that most of it is manufactured in clandestine laboratories in southern France.
The operation would last for the next few decades, until it was discovered by law enforcement in the 1960s, and eventually broken up in the 1970s by two ambitious detectives, Eddie Egan and Sonny Grasso. So, were you aware of the Mafia's French Connection? The most successful dope smuggling ring in history that operated for almost half a century? Let us know what you think in the comment section below. As always, I'm your host, Tony Hernandez, and this is Corruption Connection.